Hello everybody and welcome to another faction guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Lusitani, who are by far one of the easiest, if not the easiest barbarian factions to play in this game. They have an extremely armored unit roster, allowing the player to make a lot of mistakes and still eke out victories, simultaneously with a very easy start position, one where you don't have very many opponents and you're kind of safe nestled on the edge of the map. Because of these reasons, you don't struggle much in early game. So long as you don't overextend, you'll have a very easy time conquering all of Hispania and getting into North Africa or maybe Gaul. So in general, this campaign is rather easy, and the army of the Lusitani are both interesting and fun. So let's go check out the start position for his faction and see exactly why it's such an easy campaign. Alright everybody, so as you can see with the Lusitani, you are nestled right on the corner of the map at Lusitania, one of the safest provinces in the game. Like, essentially, unless invaders come by sea, there's no way to get outflanked here. You simply have to defend to the east and to the north, although to the north over here is such a long distance that any army that decides to assail you through this path will be visible from a very long distance away, so you don't have to worry too much about it. It's really to your east that lie potential opponents. Now, Lusitania is just a two-settlement faction, and Abora, the minor settlement for this faction, is right here. The owners of Abora, the Celtici, don't have any allies, don't have any friends, don't have any significant diplomatic encumbrance, so you don't really need to worry about them at all. Just take them out right from the beginning. It's the thing that makes the most sense. It's essentially the first move you're going to make in this campaign no matter what, and to do so, you have rather good early game troops. In fact, while this roster is rather small, as you can quite obviously see, these Lusitani medium swordsmen are amongst the best turn 1 units that a barbarian faction can start at. With 3 movement speed, javelin, although 2 javelins because of experience chevron you're going to get here. Good melee attack, melee defense, 26 weapon damage is great. 18 charge is solid, akin to good Roman infantry. This is a very solid unit, and 15 armor is pretty good for a 225 person barbarian unit. So ultimately, this is actually a very, very, very solid unit. I'd absolutely use them to make up the bulk of your early game army. In fact, I'd spam like a good 10, 12 of these in your army. Support them with some slingers. I believe them to be far more advantageous than these levy skirmishers. I think that they're just in general a lot better at killing, have way more utility. Just use your slingers, I would say. Perhaps put a couple of these Lusitani spearmen on the flanks, and you can definitely get some of these cavalry if you wish. They're a decent skirmish cav, but of course they do have low armor, which is a significant limitation here. So if you think that they're going to survive like a drawn out affair against like a spear unit or getting shot by skirmishers for a while, like this unit definitely won't do that. And of course, when this unit costs 279 and this unit costs 117, they're rather expensive. Like, you don't really need them either. This initial army that you're going to spawn with has 2 elite cavalry, or rather 1 pretty good cavalry as well, and a general cavalry unit. So you don't really need more cavalry in this army. And to be completely honest with you, this mercenary is pretty bad. Don't get this mercenary, actually. If you're gonna get cavalry, get this. I just looked at the stats for that unit. Really, really mediocre. Definitely not worth getting. So yeah, absolutely. Just spam swords. Maybe get 1 cavalry unit. Get some slingers. Get a couple of spears just to safeguard your flanks. And you have an army that will take Abora with great speed and haste. When it comes to upgrading buildings, you can just kind of get some general upgrades over here. Get the fishing. Get level 2 settlement, because you're really going to need level 3, and I'll show you why. The Lusitani are rather unique in that they have a significant amount of recruiting that's not based on their barracks, but rather based on their town settlement. And it's level 3 where amongst all your settlements, you're going to unlock a lot of important units. Those units are your Lusitani Bear Warriors, and I'm going to go over this when we look at the unit roster, but this is like an absolutely essential part of your army. You really need these guys. They will make your army way more combat effective. So level 3 is really important to hit with your settlement buildings, these Lusitani heavy infantry, which are decent. This is kind of your mid-tier sword that you're going to use until late game, and your Lusitani armored spearmen, who are pretty good. This is like a noble unit. This is a pretty effective barbarian shock spear unit. It's not the best one in the game, not even close. Like, it's just an okay one, but the good thing is that this one has combat efficiency while simultaneously having 35 armor, making him a pretty bulky unit that's also capable of killing plenty. So it's a decent unit. Definitely worth getting. So yeah, getting level 3 buildings is quite important. Now, when it comes to your continued expansion in this campaign, the thing that makes the most sense is conquering all of Hispania. That's definitely the first thing that you're going to do before you leave Hispania in general. You don't want to leave a single settlement uncovered. It's just going to be so advantageous for you economically and militarily to conquer this province, because the vast majority of these factions are Hispanic factions. So you're going to be able to get a lot of recruitable population out of these settlements. It'll just be great for your military development. Besides that, Hispania has ample resources, so economically, this will just be such a great base from which to launch your empire. And the other thing is that Hispania is just not assailable from too many angles. Like, yes, people can come from over here in Mauritania, but this crossing is a little bit remote. Like, there aren't a ton of North African settlements around here. So if an army comes here, it'll take a long time. It's just not a likely area of attack. And the only other place is either by ship from Britain, which is kind of unlikely, very unlikely actually. The other crossing is from the east, from Gaul, which, you know, it could happen once you kind of get a border here, but, you know, doesn't really make much sense for it to happen and catch you off guard. You should definitely have armies on here by the time that you've expanded to this area and be ready to invade Gaul yourself. So it's a relatively defensible province. Now, the way that you would conquer it is, of course, getting Abora first, but then afterwards, it's absolutely your decision where to go. The one massive empire that operates in this region is Carthage, so you have to decide when you want to go to war with Carthage. You can, of course, push them into war quite early on in your campaign, like literally after you take Abora, you can take on a Carthaginian settlement quite quickly. And I do find that Carthage doesn't really defend their Hispanian settlements well, but the problem is that if you declare war on Carthage before Rome declares war on Carthage, then the Carthaginians might focus in on you, and they could just raise up a nice mercenary army over here in North Africa and ship it across really quickly. And if the Carthaginians are solely focused on you, they'll have a ton of money and just throw army after army at you. So if you want to be really tactical in your campaign, it's probably best to just wait for the Punic War to begin. That way Carthage will be financially preoccupied with the Romans, and you can most likely just take their settlements without having to worry about ample Carthaginian reinforcements from North Africa. Because of that, it might be prudent for you to head north here, even though this is really long, and take Tarraconensis, because even though this province is kind of far apart and will give you roughly a border with the Gauls, it doesn't contain any Carthaginian settlements to finish this conquest off. So it might just make sense for you to take it, even though strategically it's not in the best place. The other thing that you could do is try to take Hispania. This province is a lot closer together. It does have 2 Carthaginian settlements here, but you're already at war with the Aravaci. So, these guys could just randomly attack you at any point. So after you take Abora, it might just make sense for you to silence this threat right away and take Numantia. After that, you can go and focus on taking Arce. And while you're doing those 2, the Punic Wars might just start. And then afterwards, you'll be able to take Mastia and Ibosum. Mastia and Ibosum quite quickly. Once the Punic War starts, you don't have to show any hesitation anymore. Just get in on taking Carthaginian territories with the Romans. After you take Hispania, you'll have a ton of territory, and you can expand further into the province, of course, into Tarraconensis, as well as into the Celtic lands that lie beyond the mountain range here. And that's really all that it is when it comes to the Lusitanians' campaign map position. It really isn't that hard of a start. All of these factions in Hispania have like one settlement, so you can quite easily dominate them militarily and economically. The only empire that operates here is the Carthaginians. However, the Carthaginians are really a paper tiger. Amongst all the empires that start in turn 1 in Divide et Impera, I feel like they're by far the weakest just because they're destined to get smashed by the Romans and they don't tend to last very long. Otherwise, their armies are usually constructed rather poorly. I'm not saying I've never seen a great Carthaginian army. I've seen plenty, but I just feel like the AI is pretty oblivious with how to use their armies and which units to recruit. So ultimately, I feel like taking on the Carthaginians really early really isn't that much of a challenge. You know, we don't compare to the Seleucids or, you know, to, we can say, the Ptolemies or anything like that. So yeah, just don't worry about taking them on and expand across Hispania. Afterwards, you can go into either North Africa and fight the Romans here, or you can go into Gaul. It's really up to you. But anyway, guys, that's it when it comes to the campaign map. Let's go look at the buffs and debuffs for his faction, as well as the unit roster. Alright, everybody, so for the buffs and debuffs that all Iberian factions get, you have some rather interesting ones. I wouldn't say that they're exceptionally game-altering ones, however, they're kind of cool. They do play a role in your campaign, and a noticeable one at that. Now, for your first trait, you get the +1 experience rank for all cavalry recruits. It's the same one that all the Gallic factions get, demonstrating that the Celts and Iberians have a lot of cultural similarities. In fact, the Iberians are pretty much a migratory Celtic people, at least that was their origin before they became more culturally distinct. So ultimately, it makes sense that their cavalry also get a +1 experience, and of course demonstrates the more tribalistic and warrior-like state of their culture in general. Now, Devotio is kind of cool because it basically means that all your general units will have buffed stats. Like, as a Iberian faction, whatever general you recruit, they'll just have like a +1 or +2 on several different combat stats like morale, melee attack, melee defense. So ultimately your general unit is just going to be more powerful, more buffed, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing to have your general, your all-important, perhaps the most important unit in your army, just get that extra power to them, is very, very useful. Of course, neither of these buffs are completely like campaign changing. Like, neither of them will probably lead to like decisive wins in your battles or humongous differences in how you recruit your armies or manage your economy, but they're cool to have. They're nice quality of life things. Now, when it comes to the specific Lusitanian buffs, you get pretty good ones, honestly. Increased army movement range is exceptionally useful. It's really good, particularly because your armies are going to be largely infantry-based, and you're going to be operating in a very mountainous region. It's just so good to have additional movement range and just useful throughout your entire campaign. So just a great one to have. Increased morale in mountains and hills is pretty good because that means that this buff is not exclusive to Lusitanian territory. Of course, all of Iberia is exceptionally mountainous and hilly. So this is going to impact all your battles at home, but there's plenty of areas that are also mountainous and hilly, like a lot of Gaul is, and Germania is, and, you know, even in North Africa, there's some hilly regions too. So at the end of the day, like, this is just something that's going to be useful throughout your campaign. Now, increased banditry is one of the better debuffs to have, in my opinion. Like, sure, banditry is kind of annoying. Like, it's basically like you're gambling every turn, but some province will just lose its tax income or something like that for a turn. But at the end of the day, I've seen some really horrible ones that just cripple your economy or make your military way worse or harder to afford. This one's actually relatively mild compared to a lot of the ones I've seen. Banditry you can kind of deal with. So in general, I would say that you have some pretty strong debuffs, albeit none that are completely game-breaking or just super powerful, but just really nice medium strong ones, and one really mild debuff. So at the end of the day, you just have like a really safe range of buffs and debuffs that are not difficult to understand, making this faction once again very new player friendly, very easy, and their army will surely reflect that. So let's go check out their army. Alright, everybody, so for the army of the Lusitani, you generally have pretty good armor throughout your units. However, some of the melee or attack stats of some of these units is definitely not the best. In fact, I would argue that just in general, the Lusitanian army is a little bit underpowered considering some of the other factions that we've looked at for the barbarians. Like a lot of the Celtic factions, like the Arverni, the Nervii, the Galatians, they do have, on average, better infantry, I would argue, or the Boii. However, the Lusitanian infantry is, I think, easier to use, and has one very, very, very specific trait that I should have covered earlier, I feel, but also it's just easier to talk about this in this screen, I feel, compared to, we could say, the campaign map. But every single unit in every Iberian faction can be guerrilla deployed. Well, I think except field artillery, I think. Yeah, that would be a little bit crazy. But yeah, basically every single unit other than the artillery, which I never talk about anyway, can be guerrilla deployed. And in general, I don't really like guerrilla deploy units in Rome 2. I just feel like having a unit deploy far away from your army, wherever it is vulnerable and exposed, is a pretty quick way to get them killed. And most guerrilla deploy units are pretty lightly armored in general, kind of gives them that whole cloak and dagger element. So to have a light unit posted up, hiding in some, I don't know, light forest, hoping to not get seen, I just don't really see that as a viable and consistent tactic to use. But when your whole army can guerrilla deploy, well, then that's just a mechanic you can kind of exploit. For example, if you're in a fight where, say, your opponents have reinforcements coming, you can just deploy really close to the first army, so you can just quickly annihilate them long before any reinforcements come. So it's stuff like that that just allows you to make tactical decisions that other armies don't really have. Also, your more lightly armored units, although you don't really have a ton of those, but the more lightly armored units that you do have, you don't have to worry about them getting skirmished to death, because you can just deploy really close to your enemy and avoid having a protracted skirmish. Otherwise, when you deploy closer to your enemy, that's less opportunities for cavalry to make a difference before the infantry clash. So you don't have to worry as much about having a cavalry disadvantage with a guerrilla deploy faction. So those three are the things that are kind of like off the top of my head, but guerrilla deploy has basically no drawbacks when your entire army can do that. So it just gives you so much tactical flexibility, allowing you to have slightly weaker units. Like in general, I would argue that the Celtic units are more solid on average, but Iberian units being universally guerrilla deployable makes it excusable that they're worse, because this is just such a powerful thing for you to exploit. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's just look at their generals and the other units and kind of figure out statistically where units can be used and really what their utility is. Now when it comes to your general, you do have the option of this elite spear. You can only recruit it for your general unit, so this is exclusive to your general. So if you like this unit, this is where you're gonna get it. Now this unit is pretty damn powerful. Like 14 melee attack and 12 melee defense is really good, and 29 charge bonus is phenomenal. That's really, really good. It's better than an elite sword. It makes this unit kind of shock infantry-like, and 38 armor is really solid. That's like pretty good, pretty average for like an elite unit in Divide et Impera in general. An elite hoplite would like have this. An elite sword would usually have this, although some end up having like 35 or 30, depending on which faction, but 38's like a solid number. That's the number that you want. If you have more than 38, if you have like 41, then you have one of the best armored units. So 38's good. 51 morale is also good. Like this is just a stable, steady unit. The only negative part about it is this 25 weapon damage. An elite sword will have 30 weapon damage. So ultimately this unit will get ground down by like an elite sword unit over time, as long as it's a good elite sword unit. So you have to look out for this. If you charge this into like an Imperial Legionary, they will lose the fight over time. However, this Shock Spear does have the ability to be more useful on the flanks because of his 29 charge bonus. If you get these guys into the rear of some units, they can be really good. And because of this, I would definitely employ this unit more in early game, just because, by late game, there'll be infantry around that can pretty effectively deal with this unit. However, in early game, this unit won't be challenged on the battlefield by very much, so that's where you'll probably get the most use out of this unit. Cheaper than your cavalry generals, so definitely worth it for that. But keep in mind, this unit only has 2 movement speeds, so we are a little bit bulky and slow. We'll definitely be less maneuverable than your cavalry generals. And speaking of that, you do have the option of Lusitani heavy shock cavalry. Now, this unit is exceptionally armored at 41 armor, However, her combat stats just aren't good. Like 10 melee attack and 13 melee defense is pretty abysmal for like an elite cavalry unit. That's just not good. It's not terrible in general, but for an elite cavalry unit, it doesn't really cut it. 50 charge bonus is good. You know, kind of akin to one of those melee cavalries that are pretty good at hammer and anvils. But obviously, this is not a shock cavalry by like Alexandrian style or Alexandrian standards or anything like that. This unit won't deliver a super crippling charge, but 50 is definitely competent. Really, where this unit's good is the 41 armor. This unit won't die particularly easily, and that's kind of an asset for your general. Like, what I find is that my general most often dies when I've just poorly microed him, like I've just accidentally left him in combat for too long. And because of that, I feel like that 41 armor will definitely probably save my general once or twice per campaign. So definitely useful for that, but not the best combat stats. You can't confidently swing this cavalry around and expect to beat enemy elite cavalry. These guys will best most mid-cavalry, but definitely weak amongst elite units, although very well armored. Now, this other option, the heavy missile cavalry, is one of those hybrid units that I so despise typically, but this one's actually legitimately really good. You know, 95 range as well as 23 missile damage gives it elite skirmish capabilities. 10 ammunition's actually really good. Like most of these javelin hybrids usually only have like 6 or 5 ammo, so to have 10 really lets this guy shoot for a while. Meanwhile, 40 charge is really good for a unit of this type. 42 weapon damage is exceptional. This unit is just really solid in combat. And then 38 armor is also good. Like typically when you have a hybrid that's combat effective, you end up losing out on the armor, but this one has 38 armor, which is great. And 6 speed, which also makes this one pretty quick. In fact, when you compare this one to the Lusitani heavy shot cav, it has 6 speed. The heavy missile cav speed is more filled out. So ultimately, the only thing that this shock cavalry is going to do better than this heavy cavalry is that it's going to be a little bit more armored. It's going to have a bit more morale, but that's it. That's it. It's going to charge better, but only by 10. This unit's not great at charging, but 40 charge bonus is definitely still capable of delivering a crippling blow in a hammer and anvil. So at the end of the day, like this heavy missile cav probably is better in melee combat than this heavy shock cavalry. At the very least, they're essentially equivalent in terms of their melee capabilities, but this heavy missile cav can shoot 10 elite javelins, which is, you know, completely different. So that's really the difference. I would argue that the heavy missile cavalry is just a more solid unit in general, but the shock cavalry is cheaper and more armored if you just like having that little luxury of being able to leave your unit in battle. So that's really it when it comes to your generals. Again, you know, the shock spear is more of an early game general. When it comes to the cavalry, I feel like the heavy cavalry is going to be more combat effective if you use it, but then this heavy cavalry would be more new player friendly. Now moving on to your melee line. You don't have a lot of options, but all the options that you have serve their own purpose. Literally all of his units have, like, you have a reason to recruit every single one of them. So really no wastage when it comes to his melee infantry line. Now your Lusitanian medium swords are the first unit here, and they're going to be your main line in early game. A really solid early game barbarian unit. Really, really solid. Like genuinely, for an early game barbarian unit, like a turn 1 recruitment barbarian unit, you have no reason to complain with this unit. 11 melee attack solid. 7 melee defense is a bit of a weakness, but ultimately, for a more offensively minded turn 1 barbarian, you kind of expect the melee defense to not be great. Charge bonus of 18 is good for his sword, absolutely serviceable. Makes these guys effective in a rear charge, but also, you know, good frontally. Like this 18 charge will probably exceed the charge bonus of many units that you're fighting in early game. Weapon damage of 26 is really good. This is where this unit performs exceptionally well. You know, an elite sword's only going to have 30 weapon damage, which isn't even far away from these guys. So ultimately, these guys are just competent in the grind. But what I hope that these stats make you recognize is that this is more of a grindy unit ultimately. Like, they hit hard, and they have a decent chance of hitting because of his melee attack, but the charge bonus really isn't much to talk about. 18 solid, but it's not amazing. 7 melee defense does make these guys a little bit susceptible to being ground down, though. And same thing with his base morale. 39 is not horrible, but not amazing either. These guys can get overwhelmed rather easy. So don't think these guys invincible. They do need ample support. You do need to make the right decisions. They can get torn apart pretty quickly if they get slammed into with an irresistible force. But 15 armor does allow them to be pretty stable in melee, but 15 armor is pretty dang good. For an early game barbarian, this is better than the overwhelming majority of options you're going to get across factions. So definitely a remarkable trait. So just overall, this is a really solid early game unit. You'll have no trouble taking your first couple of settlements because of these guys. Now, this is the second unit you get, and as I showed on the campaign map, they're recruitable from your Town Hall building, which is a rather unique trait. That's where you get them. And this is an absolutely essential unit. I mean, these guys are just similar to, like, elite Thracian infantry. Like, 36 charge bonus is absurd! Absolutely absurd. It's similar to your heavily armored missile cavalry, the one that we were talking about for the general. This infantry unit has a similar charge. 51 morale is excellent. 17 melee attack is crazy. And yes, these guys are pretty squishy. They only have 20 armor, 5 melee defense, and these guys have no shield because they carry a two-handed axe into battle. But with this charge bonus, this attack, as well as his armor penetration, this is the ideal flank unit. And one more thing. These guys also have the scare ability. So, if they charge into the rear of the enemy as well as frontally, these guys just scare your opponent away. And I've just charged these guys like frontally into legionaries as well as elite barbarian infantry, and I've seen these guys just win with a head-on confrontation, not even a rear charge. So ultimately, these guys are phenomenal. Ideally, you'd bring 4 into an army, I would say. Maybe 2. They are pretty expensive, and they do come from your first population class. That's really the only negative of these guys. But otherwise, they're just such an essential unit. And as I'll cover later, your infantry, while not lackluster, is marginally worse than, I would say, like the standard infantry of a good infantry faction. And because of that, you kind of do need something to help balance this faction out. Now, guerrilla deployment does help you do that because, again, like we talked about, you can kind of counter enemy cavalry, you can avoid skirmishing, or, if you don't want to do that, you can deploy far away. You can also just kind of overwhelm the enemy and maybe, like, get better charges on them by, using guerrilla deployment. But ultimately, what will really seal the deal for this faction and make for swords that are maybe a tiny bit weaker than like a Roman or a good Gallic faction sword, what will ultimately make these guys match up is these bear warriors, because that scare effect will just ruin enemy morale. And the charge of these guys will butcher the enemy on the flanks most of the time. So just really good. Bring this unit. Pivotal unit in this roster. I can't stress that enough. They're Lusitani and heavy infantry. They're like a solid unit. Now you do get a reformed version of this unit at turn 90. So this is what we consider like your early game mid-tier sword. And they're just good. Like 30 armor is pretty good for like a mid-tier sword. 13 melee attack and 10 melee defense is okay. 28 weapon damage is pretty good, and 19 charge bonus is alright. Like this unit's just decent. Like amongst early game kind of mid-tier swords that barbarians are gonna get, this unit's just smack dab in the middle. It's a bit more defensive than some of the ones that you see because some of them have less armor but better charge and more attack, maybe like 30 weapon damage. This one's going to be more defensive, but having 30 armor on a mid-tier barbarian sword from like pretty early on in the campaign, it's pretty good. But yeah, you get these guys when you get your level 3 building for your town hall. But you can also get them through the barrack, unlike the bear warriors, which you can't. Believe that you get them with the tier 2 or tier 3 barrack. I think it's believe it is tier 3 that you get these guys. But moving on, now you have the Lusitani foot guard. And this is your first elite unit that I'm going to show you. I mean, actually, I guess that the Bear Warriors are elite too. I'm mistaken. But these guys come from your first population class. They're a very solid sword unit. Very solid. very maneuverable. The thing I want you to point out that's very, very unique about this unit is the 3 movement speed, despite this unit being a heavy melee infantry with 35 armor. Kind of shows that these nobles, they're just very martial, that they train a lot, that they're just natural athletes from good bloodlines. Now, the combat stats of this unit, they're good, but not great. 21 charge bonus is definitely above average when it comes to like a sword unit. However, it's just similar to that like your typical Celtic or Gallic sword would have. It's very similar, very similar. Actually, I believe it's exact same number. Now that my memory is catching up here, like we look at a Galician Chosen, yeah, same number. Where these guys are going to be worse than your typical Gallic elite sword is that it's going to have 2 less weapon damage, 1 more melee defense, but 1 less melee attack, which kind of balances out. Although the 3 movement speed is unique, and this unit does have a javelin too. So it's pretty similar to what you'd expect of like a Gallic sword, but I feel like it's a little bit harder to use, because the Gallic sword would win in a grind out fight, where this unit would win is if you can use that additional speed in that volley of javelins to outmaneuver and outposition your opponent. Like this unit ultimately has more ability to traverse the battlefield. If you can use this unit tactically soundly, it can be better. But if you just throw it into battle, it is worse than your typical barbarian elite sword, I would say. So that's kind of the challenge when it comes to using this, but this is the elite sword that you're going to have until you hit turn 90 and you get your reformed units. So if you want elite sword, this is the one you're going to have to use, and it's okay, it's decent. It'll still kill most of the things on the battlefield. But beware, if you meet an enemy adversary of a similar class, you might get outmatched. Now, your Iberian Reformed Heavy Swordsmen are very, very solid. They have identical stats to Gallic Elite Swords, with the exception of melee defense, which they have 1 less than. But this unit also has 38 armor, which is a little bit rare amongst Barbarian swords. Like, a lot of elite Barbarian swords end up having 35 armor, particularly ones that come from your 2nd population class. And luckily, this one does come from your 2nd population class. So that is definitely advantageous when it comes to this unit. You can recruit them en masse, like in your late campaign. Like, as long as you can afford them, and they are pretty expensive, mind you. You can recruit a ton of these guys, but they're very well armored at 38 armor, come with a volley of javelins, which is just nice and convenient. That 1 less melee defense will make these guys slightly worse in a grind out fight, but they're still great grinders. And the 21 charge bonus makes them effective when hitting a flank as well. For heavy melee infantry, so, they have a good mass as well. This overall great unit. They're not as good as, like, Galician Thorax infantry or whatever. They're not as good as, like, Arverni Oathsworn. They're not as good as Arverni Oathsworn. These guys have 1 more melee defense, as well as, better base morale as well. Overall, like, there's some Gauls that are better, and that's what I mean by your melee infantry is a little bit mediocre. Like, this unit's just an okay mid-tier early game unit. This unit, the Lusitani Foot Guard, are a bit weaker than enemy elites, and then this Iberian Reformed Heavy Swordsman is a bit weaker than enemy, like, Reformed Elite Swordsman. So that's why I think that these Lusitani Bear Warriors are really the way that you're going to even out the fight, because this is just such a solid unit overall. But moving on to your Spear Infantry, you're going to start out with your Lusitani Light Spearmen. These are not your typical levies, because this one has 15 armor, still maintains your 225 units. This is a light spear infantry rather than very light, which is nice. It's nice to have a little bit more mass. And they have a volley of javelins too. Because overall, this is like a solid militia. It's not a super combat effective militia, so at the end of the day, don't throw these guys into combat thinking that they're going to do amazing or anything. With 6 melee attack and 12 melee defense, this additional armor is only going to help it out somewhat. But because of his armor, I would trust these guys to guard flanks against early game cavalry quite easily. I think that that's definitely going to happen. But moving on to these Lusitanian veteran spearmen, these guys are great. Now, they come with your 2nd barrack, which is just amazing. Now, you can get these guys pretty early on into campaign, and they are just, in general, great units. I love this unit. It comes from your second population class, so it's pretty easy to get. And with 12 melee attack, 13 melee defense, a charge bonus of 26, and weapon damage of 23, this is just a great shock spear. This unit is going to safeguard your flanks against cavalry eloquently, far better than these levies. Like, these guys, because they're medium, because they have more bonus, there's cavalry as well, it's just far better combat stats. These guys will absolutely eviscerate enemy cavalry if they get into combat with them, and they still maintain 3 speed, meaning that these guys can quite easily maneuver along the flanks, you know, commit to hammer and anvils, all of that. 51 base morale means that they won't rout very easy, and 20 armor is pretty good. These guys are also just very cost effective. As you can see, they don't cost very much. You know, the campaign map, that's reflected. Like, these guys just aren't very expensive. You know, only marginally more expensive than these Lusitani medium swordsmen, and they'll be much cheaper than your sword corps. So do consider them. They're a very effective unit for the price. Not game breaking, for sure. Like, this 23 weapon damage is a weakness, so if these guys get entangled with enemy swordsmen for too long in combat, they can get wrecked. This is not the type of unit that you want frontally confronting swordsmen. But if you keep them along the flanks and maneuver with them gracefully and get good hammer and anvils, you know, put them up against enemy cavalry, against enemy skirmishers, they will absolutely suit you well. Great unit to have. Your Lusitania and medium spearmen are basically an alternative to these guys. This is like your defensive spear. You know, it has more armor but less morale. It's also slower, but it has way better defensive stats. Way better defensive stats. So at the end of the day, if you're looking for a spearman that's going to last longer, if you're looking for a spearman with which to make your main army out of, like, say, you know, you want to have heavy infantry and you want to have reformed swords or Lusitani foot guard, but you don't have the money for it or whatever, these guys come from your second population and you could totally use them. These guys are pretty much equivalent to Freo spears, but the problem is that they only have 150 men compared to, you know, the Greek version or the Celtic version that'll have 225. You know, while these guys are like of a solid medium mass and, you know, do have decent stats, I don't feel like they're great just because, you know, having 150 men when the vast majority of factions will get a 225 unit equivalent really isn't amazing. And literally the only thing that this one does better than a typical Freo spear, like an absolutely generic Freo spear, like let's find a generic one. Here we go, of Epirus. Like, look, this unit has the same combat stats, I believe. Scutari, yeah, the Scutari doesn't have anything better other than it's gonna have 5 more armor and slightly more morale, which isn't great. Especially because these guys are also slower than those Freo spears I just showcased. Because when your barbarian unit is kind of worse than like the Greek equivalent infantry wise, you know that you're not looking at a super strong unit. So just between these two, I feel like your veteran spearmen are just so much better, so much more unique, so much more versatile. With only 5 less armor and having more morale, this unit isn't even like that much weaker when it comes to lasting in combat. And like, yeah, they have less melee defense, but they have way more melee attack and way more charge. So just overall, I take your Lusitani veterans any day of the week. But once you hit turn 90, you do get a reformed version of the Scutari, and this is where they do become significantly more powerful, because having 8 melee attack and 19 melee defense, and, you know, 24 weapon damage, 90 charge, these are like elite spear stats. This is like what you'd expect of like an elite hoplite statistically. Minus the armor. 25 armor is still pretty bad, but because these guys do have elite spear stats, they are pretty decent, and, you know, they're still cheaper than any of your swords. So I would say with this reformed Scutari spearmen, this is where you see a point to recruiting them. The regular I never get, but this reformed one, you can definitely get them. If you want to just have a nice kind of mid-tier army, just have a solid line that's also, you know, not as expensive, I feel like you can rely on these guys. And combat effective wise, they probably do better than this heavy infantry, to be honest. Like, they'll kill slower, but I think that they'll last longer in combat. They do have same speed, same javelins, you know, actually pretty similar. To be honest, the Scutari spearmen just aren't amazing. They're kind of lackluster. Like, they're usable, but They're really not super good. They're just really, really lackluster. Moving on to your armored spearmen. This is, of course, the better version of the Lusitani veteran spearmen. You don't need to wait for reforms, but you do have to get a higher level barrack or get level 3 building. This unit is from your first population class, so that's really where you do end up paying the most when it comes to this upgrade. You know, this is from from your second population class. This is from your first population class. Come from your nobles. But this unit does have more armor. 15 more armor. A substantial difference. Better combat stats too. You know, this unit has actually... Actually, you know what? The combat stats of the veteran spearmen are better, which is actually kind of crazy. Like, same weapon damage, same charge bonus. This Lusitani veteran has 2 more melee defense. And it has better morale. You know what? To be entirely honest with you, I would take the veteran spearmen. I would take the veteran spearmen over these armored spearmen. The veteran spearmen are going to be cheaper to maintain. They have more morale, better combat stats. The only thing that this Lusitani armored spearmen does better is they have 15 more armor, which is substantial, don't get me wrong. You know, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if the armored spearmen would beat this veteran spearmen in a 1v1. But considering that this unit's way easier to recruit population-wise and for cheaper to maintain, I would just take the veteran spearmen. This is by far the most cost-effective unit amongst your spears. That and the light spearmen. I would stick to these. Use your melee infantry more as your core. You know, your bear warriors is kind of your X factor in your army. And, you know, you can have some Lusitani veteran spearmen on the flank supporting the bear warriors and just push through enemy cavalry with these guys. Push through whatever infantry are on the flank. But I wouldn't really deal with these guys. Maybe you could use Reformed Scutari as a main line if you're trying to save money on your main line and avoid your swords, but it's really all I would do with the spears. And this armored spearman, not a very good elite unit, I have to say. Not impressed with these guys. Now moving on to your skirmishers, you don't have a ton of options, but you have some decent ones. This levy skirmisher is rather cheap. They do pretty decent damage if you charge them into a flank, because they do have 24 charge bonus and, you know, 12 armor penetration, which is really high. But because of their low melee attack and defense, the moment an enemy starts to focus on these guys, they will flee. 1 armor and 30 morale will ensure that. But if these guys get an uninterrupted rear charge, they can do some damage. Their skirmish abilities are actually pretty decent for a levy. You know, having 85 range and 21 missile damage is better than average, so I feel like that's decent. Like, overall, this is just a decent levy skirmisher, but you have to remember, we're a levy skirmisher. We're not going to be game-changing or whatever, but this unit can do some damage in the right circumstances. The upgrade on these guys are the Lusitani ambushers, and these guys come with 150 men rather than the 131 of these guys. Now, this unit is just better than the levy skirmisher. Like, same armor, better morale, you know, better armor penetration, slightly less weapon damage. Actually, the charge bonus is significantly higher in the levy skirmisher. I mean, again, honestly, I feel like the levy skirmisher would be better in melee slightly, but the Lusitani ambusher is just a way better skirmish unit. 95 range is crazy from its price point. 22 missile damage is also close to elite. This is just really good at throwing javelins. They aren't as good in melee as your levy skirmisher, but they're almost as good. And keep in mind, this unit also has 150 men, so maybe they're equivalent, I have to say. I didn't really think about the 150 men, but yeah, in melee they're equivalent, but this unit's going to do way more damage skirmishing. And also, this unit has 2 more ammo. Like, this Lusitani ambusher is a crazy cost-effective unit. The only negative of it is that it comes from your second population class, which is super rare for a low-tier skirmisher to come from your second population class. But you have to pay for them in some way, because if these guys came from your third population class, I would advise that you just spam them mercilessly. This unit is such good bang for buck. Insane bang for buck. Super cheap unit. Just amazing at skirmishing, has some melee capabilities with this armor penetration and okayish charge and stuff like that. So just overall, grab this unit. Great skirmish unit. But if you're looking for long range, get your Lusitani slingers. These guys are just solid. They are slightly worse than Celtic slingers because they have 27 morale. Sorry, I said morale. base morale. Yeah, 27 base morale, making them slightly worse. They don't really have combat stats that are worth talking about, because like 1 armor combined with no melee attack, no melee defense, crap charge, horrible charge. Just overall, this unit is basically worthless when it comes to melee, making him purely a long-range skirmisher. As I've outlined, these guys are more cost-effective, like, or cheaper, and they have melee capabilities. But if you really like your long range, grab these guys. They won't really upset you. You do have Balearic Slingers as a mercenary, but because they're not in your roster, I won't cover them. Now, this unit's kind of interesting. Like, they do come after your turn 90 reforms. You have to wait for them. But his unit is just super solid. Super duper solid. Like, it's not a good skirmisher, mind you, okay? Only 4 ammo. Only 4 ammo. This is more of like a hybrid infantry than a skirmisher. And 19 missile damage is really crap. Your levies somehow do more missile damage. And this is like a professional unit. But they have 150 men, 12 melee attack, 11 melee defense. Makes them have the same stats as your elite spear in melee. 26 charge bonus, 23 weapon damage. Also identical to your elite spear. You see where I'm getting at, boys. Yes, these guys do have a little bit of limitations when it comes to armor, but 25 is really good for a skirmisher. Also, 6 armor penetration ain't bad, and then 4 speed is crazy on a unit like this. You know, to have elite spear stats, or, you know, this isn't a very good elite spear to be fair, but to have stats that replicate an elite spear, even if it's one of the crappiest ones, and still be a skirmisher and have 4 movement speed, makes these guys just an exceptional bit of flexibility in your army. That's what these guys are. They're just super flexible, super competent, a bit expensive. So considering that you have like an insanely cost-effective unit in your Lusitani ambushers, I don't know if you're going to want to bring these guys, but if you just want to buff up that armored component of your army, just keep your units extremely dense, extremely hard to knock off your feet. This is just a great thing, because 25 armor as well as these really competent melee stats will just let these guys seamlessly enter your melee line and just be super duper good. Now your shock cavalry is kind of interesting. Like with Lusitani and medium shock cavalry, this is honestly the unit that I like the most out of this roster, because 28 armor is pretty good, but you guys also have 90 men and are a heavy unit. So just the mass is combined with the armor makes these guys pretty damn good, and 7 speed is really good for a heavy unit too. These guys come from your 2nd population class, so they're still reasonably easy to recruit. So just in general, I like this unit. Just very, very decent. The 9 melee attack, 11 melee defense isn't great. 48 charge bonus is usable, but not amazing. And same thing with 26 weapon damage. But considering that this unit has 90 men, I consider these guys better than, you know, a citizen cavalry. Of course, this unit guerrilla deploys as well, so they'll be with the rest of your boys. Just a general super duper solid, super duper cost-effective unit. You know, you do need to recruit these guys from a separate cavalry barrack, so, you know, it'll take a little bit of time to get them, but just overall, I love this unit. Just super duper good for what it is. Your Lusitanian heavy shock cavalry comes from your 1st population class, and we're really not that great considering that, but I already covered them in the general thing. We're just pretty lackluster when it comes to combat for, like, you know, an elite cavalry. Like this medium cavalry, they're good combat wise considering that they are a mid-tier barbarian cavalry, but this unit for an elite one really isn't great. The only asset is the armor. Moving on to your missile cavalry. I typically don't advise for you to get missile cavalry, but the Lusitani actually have decent options. Now this is the one that you get turn 1. Pretty good at combat, albeit 18 armor is the limitation here, and they are of a light mass, so, you know, beware. At the end of the day, this is a pretty squishy cavalry unit. I'd vastly prefer to bring the medium shock cavalry, but you do need to build the specific barrack for it. So it'll take a little bit of time for you to get them, but I just feel like this is way more useful and for cheaper than these guys. So at the end of the day, this is just a way better unit in my opinion, just way more easy to deploy in your campaign. Just overall, this is just way better. This one's just okay. But the heavy missile cavalry, which we also talked about with the general, is just so good. This is just a perfect hybrid. You know, still fast, still really good at skirmishing, great melee stats. Like the only thing that this one doesn't do amazingly is a charge bonus, but 40 is still solid. Just overall, this is a really good cavalry unit too. So when it comes to your elites, you're going to want to use your Lusitani heavy missile cavalry because this is just an exceptional hybrid. When it comes to your mid or low tiers, whatever you want to call them, use your Lusitani medium shock cavalry because this is a unique and just oddly powerful cavalry for the price. Neither of these are game breaking, but they're both just really cost effective. You know, they're not anywhere close to the best cavalry units in the game, but they're definitely up there when it comes to the most cost-effective cavalry units. So that's how you can kind of judge the Lusitani roster. And just overall, I feel like this roster has class. Like for missiles, you have interesting cost-effective options, just usable long-range options. For cavalry, you have a usable, mid-tier option, a usable high-tier option. Your swords are solid, not the best in the game, but competitive, and you do have an X-Factor unit as well as very strong early game presence, and just a very unique shock spear in this Lusitani veteran spearman, just a great help to have to your army, as well as the levy spearman if you're going light or cheap. Just at the end of the day, I feel like this army is so well crafted, so cohesive. So overall, because of the guerrilla deployment too, which you have to factor in, I'm going to give this a really good score for a barbarian faction. 7 out of 10 when it comes to how powerful this faction is. And in terms of how difficult it is, when you combine that super safe start position and you're in a really kind of weak province, Hispania, like there just aren't that many factions that can give you grief, I think it's just a really easy campaign. This is like a 3 out of 10 or 2.5 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. And you can exploit guerrilla deployment so much against the AI too. Because overall, this is inarguably a really easy campaign. And most of the barbarians just aren't easy. Most of them are really hard and somewhat complex at the beginning. So this is just refreshing. Like if you just really want to try a barbarian faction out and you don't want to struggle, this is the one. This is the one where you can get your feet wet effortlessly. Try these guys out. In terms of how much you need to play this campaign, I'd say they're cool. The guerrilla deploy mechanic is just so unique to have in Divide et Impera. And that factors into how much I'd advise people to try this campaign out. Also, if you want to try out an Iberian faction, this is a good place to start because of how easy they are. Simultaneously, it's kind of a cool province to have to start it. Like, I didn't show you guys the mercenary recruitment, but they have some of the most unique mercenaries in the game. And fighting Carthage in early game but not being Rome is also kind of unique too. And just overall, this faction is kind of charming. Like when you just look at their general aesthetic, they kind of feel like a Dark Age faction. Like a medieval faction. Like they're just kind of cool. So overall, like I'm a little bit biased. Like I have a soft spot for these guys. I feel like they're up there with my favorite factions. So in terms of how much you need to try this campaign, I would say that this is like a 6.5 out of 10. Like you don't necessarily need to try these guys. You're not missing out if you don't. But these guys do have a charm that puts them up above average in my opinion. And just a very unique, very unique set of circumstances that you start with. And that's when it comes to the Lusitani. If you like the guide, please like and subscribe to my channel. And yeah, that's really all I have to say. See you guys in the next video. Bye for now.